All right, so now it is time for Pros and Cons, where I bring on a conservative writer, a conservative activist, or a politician or professional think tanker, as I like to call them, onto the show to interview them about what exactly is going on, about whatever issue we're tackling today. And obviously, we've been tackling this issue for the last 2-3 weeks now, the coronavirus. Today, joining me is Tyler Grant. He's a lawyer, poet, Fulbright fellow, triathlete, Renaissance man, and someone I consider a China expert, but also a Tyler expert. Tyler, long time no see, and thank you for coming on to the show.
Yeah, for having me, Brad.
Oh, goodness. There we go. All right, so on this show last week, I broke down the full timeline of how China and its communist leadership bungled this thing from the get-go as an explanation for why this virus is justifiably called the Chinese virus. And what we've been doing on the show is trying to add emphasis on the communist side of this equation, that it is a product of communism necessitating sole control over the dissemination of information to maintain political legitimacy and power. So we're trying to shift that dialogue and change the name to the more aptly called, in my opinion, Chinese Communist Party virus, or the CCPV, as one of my Twitter followers pointed out. I like that for short. So after I did that last week for the show, I saw your great piece in the Washington Examiner explaining exactly this phenomenon. For the viewers, it's called Useful Idiocracy. Go check it out in full. But Tyler, for the listeners who are busy driving or working while they're listening to the show, summarize what you did with this piece for us.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. I decided that I wanted to write a piece after I saw countless journalists, Twitter personalities writing these oddly, what seemed like cover for the Chinese Communist Party, where what you have to understand is anytime you see propaganda information coming out of China, anything that seems too good to be true, it probably is. And I saw more often than not people. The first instance that really shook me was seeing China is sending aid to the Italians, and I was like, well, they probably sold it to the Italians. They didn't send free aid, and that turned out to be exactly what it was. They sent the Chinese doctors, of which they, were the experts that had been in Wuhan and experienced what had gone on there to help the Italians, but also it sent them a bunch of ventilators and a bunch of medical equipment. But what we found out is that those were already pre-existing orders and sales. And so I started digging into this and seeing more and more often these journalists posting these articles and different emphasis of different ways in which the Chinese were actually better at response to the coronavirus and the way the Trump administration's handling it. And I just thought that analysis was absolutely bizarre. So I started writing it up, and the more those articles came out, the more that the Chinese Communist Party was echoing those points, thereby completing the feedback loop where they could show to the people, oh, look, like even American journalists agree with us that this is bungled by the Trump administration. We handled it, we curbed it, and now we're helping the world and we're the leader on it, which is exactly what Beijing wanted to do, and they had bungled it the whole time. So in essence, we could talk about the way that the Trump administration handled it relative to the way that Beijing handled it. But at the same time, you should never find yourself in a position where you're giving any ammunition whatsoever to the Chinese Communist Party, and frankly, a lot of American journalists did.
And I think that's a perfect and great summarization of an even greater article. One part I particularly enjoyed is how you introduce the instances where the media is indeed covering for the CCP, as you say. As you say in the article, it is to be expected that the Chinese Communist Party is pushing disinformation around its mishandling of the virus that originated within its country's borders. What's worse is that American journalists running similar cover for the party. New York Times reporter Ian Johnson wrote a piece last week entitled, "China Bought the West Time, the West Squandered It." Not to be outdone, which I think it's a perfect way to put the media's response to this whole thing. Atlantic staff writer Anne Applebaum authored her own called "The Coronavirus Called America's Bluff," using a pro-colonialism hook. I'm sure that will go over well at Upper East Side cocktail parties. Applebaum's argument is nothing more than an elaborate bit of whataboutism, essentially claiming that while China's response was bad, President Trump's response could potentially be much worse and thus put us on par with China, as if the Trump administration and the Chinese are equally situated in the spread of the virus. And here I took this as that all the hubbub in the media, right? The calls of racism and xenophobia and attacking the president for spreading quote unquote false hope is really at its core just another get Trump attack and a symptom of the Trump derangement syndrome. Now, while there are definitely valid criticisms of the president, I've highlighted them in our show about the handling of this crisis. To what extent do you think this is true? And if it's not Trump derangement syndrome, what do you think it is, and why is it happening?
So I think the most apt metaphor that I've used, and I've seen other people express similar views as well, is it's as if a house is on fire in the woods, and the Chinese government, being the initial responders, tell everybody that actually it's just a house in the woods, they got it contained. And so, while the fire department down the road is prepared, they're not immediately trying to respond because they don't think anything's up. Suddenly, house in the woods loses containment, starts burning the forest, and people start seeing it burns faster and faster and faster, catching everything else on fire. Now, the other fire department down the street, not prepared and being told different information about the cottage in the woods, is now underprepared to deal with a forest fire of epic proportions. And that's what's happened. And you've seen all these people try to equate this bizarre false equivalency between what the Chinese Communist Party knew, could have known, and did in response to what the Trump administration did, while at the same time undercutting the very things of which he did in the first place. So, when it first broke down, obviously there's been just multiple instances of the media saying, "Don't worry about it. The racism that comes out of this will be worse than the actual virus." Then he shuts down the border with China. Well, now we're going into xenophobia territory. Like, well, actually, wow, this is really spreading quickly. Why didn't he do this all sooner? And frankly, when it comes to national disasters, certainly health disasters, a lot of a similar type of idea with 9/11, where it's like, well, how did they not know that this was going on? And actually they did know, but they should have acted more quickly, etc. And what you come to realize is that some of this, they're making actual policy decisions based upon what they think could or could not happen. I surprised a lot of people when I had this discussion the other day on a kind of a Zoom call with some different reporters, when I said, actually in Madagascar, every few years the bubonic plague comes back around, kills a couple hundred people every time. And the last time it happened was like in 2017. Never hear about that. You never see the borders shut down in Madagascar. You see minimal containment by the WHO. You don't hear the UN talking about it. You don't hear the CDC talking about it. Similar thing happened with this instance, where people said, hey, a couple people are dying in Wuhan of a novel type of virus. It's similar to pneumonia, and it's killing some people. And so I'm sure that all these professionals were telling Trump particular things, and Trump was saying, okay, let's keep an eye on it. And the more that this happened, the more people realized, well, wait a minute, this is escalating quickly. And you've seen the ramp up that's happened recently. And I think 2016 broke a lot of people's brains and made them think, my responsibility as a journalist, as a writer, as a thinker, is to undercut what the other team is doing, because if I'm not doing that, I'm somehow enabling them. And I think that works both ways. But I think in this instance, you're seeing it more clearly, because I saw, for example, I saw a lady that Trump had said, I want to get the economy open back up by Easter. I would love to get it open back up by Easter. She tweets out a response to that saying, Trump sets a deadline for Easter for opening back up the economy. And you just look at that, and on its face, you just see that that's not true. But this is somebody for CNBC. You see people on MSNBC mischaracterize, Trump doesn't turn open the Defense Protection Act or whatever it's called. And he's asked every single press conference, have you used the Defense Protection Act? He says, yeah, we authorize the use of it. We know that we can do it. But every time we engage these private companies to do something, they agree to do it. We don't have to mobilize them to do it because they agree to do it. So rather than the federal government having to coerce you by force, which is what the act essentially is, they're having people voluntarily turning their business machinations to do the thing that they said that they wanted to do. But then you see people on Twitter echo the point, well, the president's not doing something because he's not using this particular thing. And you just kind of look at that like, why are you people constantly trying to undermine your own credibility? So yeah, to your question, I think 2016 broke a lot of people. I think Trump derangement syndrome is very much so a syndrome on both teams, that I have to protect my team at all costs, and I don't care the means and mechanisms that I have to do to get there.
And you pointed out some great overt lies coming from the press on China's handling of the coronavirus from the outset. In your article, you just mentioned some new ones that I had never heard of that I think are fantastic. But we also see lies of omission, which can be just as damaging, but even more pernicious. And you make this point quite clearly in your piece when you say, from a global response perspective, it was widely reported that China was sending experts, ventilators, and masks to Italy. Applebaum and many others applauded the move as demonstration of Chinese global leadership dwarfing the Trump administration's response to the pandemic. Of course, this framing lacked the fundamental context, which is the context that you already mentioned earlier in the podcast. As the Washington Post later reported, those shipments of goods are, in at least some cases, not donations, but rather exports of goods for purchase. And 1,000 ventilators is a decent deal for a country trying to get its business sector restarted. So, Tyler, you mentioned those lies of omission, but now give our viewers and listeners the details on what China is doing currently from a global aid perspective.
Yeah, so I always think it's really funny, just to come back to the point about them being the global leader. I've seen this now. I've seen this talking point now several times. I've seen it in Xinhua. I've also seen different party officials try to push that out as a talking point. And I always think that's like kind of fascinating. It's as if the Chinese released like a criminal into the world, and rather than being like, oh, hey, like, we're going to help you. We're going to send cops to help find the person. We're going to send you like weapons and help defend against it. Oh, but when we catch the person, we want you to tell us how great we are at catching criminals, rather than being like, man, well, you guys really need to talk about your containment strategies and your different prisons. And that's what's happening. You're looking at this like, how can you run cover for these people? Like, they clearly let something out into the world, and they lied about the samples. They lied and buried evidence. They've disappeared God knows how many people, two that we know of, two that are very prominent, and a doctor that died of his illness because they put him into a forced quarantine. They were pulling people out of their homes, giving misinformation about the levels of the disease, such that Vox, Washington Post, New York Times were talking about how minimal this was relative to the flu. I mean, they said that, and now their talking point is, well, actually, Trump is saying that. It's this crazy gaslighting, false equivalency that we will never see this level again with any other person. I'm convinced of. It's just, there's something about him that just broke people's minds, and they have to get him. But on the second point about like what they're trying to do, I mean, I've seen a couple of instances, they're trying to send global aid. I mean, there's been some sort of what Angela Merkel called reciprocity with information and medical equipment that they sent from Germany to China, and now China's sending it back to Europe and Germany. And she called that reciprocity, which actually was kind of interesting. A word choice, rather than being like, thank you for sending this. She's like, no, we sent you a bunch of stuff, you owed us, thanks. Which I find to be kind of a peculiar usage, especially coming from someone like Angela Merkel. But also, you've seen China's been really leaning on their African resources. I mean, there's a really interesting book, China's Second Continent, that is talking about all the resources that they're pulling from Africa. I think they're using a lot of those resources to send around the world and create different trade relationships. And it's unclear, at least from what I've been reading, whether or not those relationships are actually considered aid or if they're being considered some sort of sale agreement. But I think more will come on that. But it at this point looks like it's aid. But I think some of this will come out that no, China was just exploiting like trade agreements. But it was interesting because in my piece it did talk about this. Ventilators. I mean, they're needing to make big time sales. These are very expensive pieces of equipment, and what better way to get your economy restarted than a huge sale of thousands of ventilators? And that's what they're doing, at least from the Italian perspective.
I think that I also let's jump back to the press. I also couldn't help but notice the commonalities between the press's statements and the action of the left during the Cold War, covering for the USSR. I mean, these leftists are folks that Stalinists in Russia called useful idiots, which I believe is where you drew the name from your article. So if our listeners don't know, explain for them the commonalities between these two phenomena, and why will this present-day iteration do damage, if not on par, or to what extent will the damage be compared to that of the useful idiots during the Cold War?
Yeah, so I'm not a super Cold War expert, so I guess I'm from a propaganda standpoint, of which I am very familiar. I think that what we're seeing is the feedback loop of which I talked about, which is they get journalists from a foreign country to repeat that information, and then they use that information as vindication of their initial piece of information that they sent out, and using it and citing it as evidence of that. I think you know, as far as the USSR, the Cold War, I mean, what we don't understand as Americans is we like to play the game and thinking that the game is all about ourselves, and that we're everything that we say is in this like little loop of an American idea, and people that are pushing out these little think pieces in Washington Post and the Atlantic and all this stuff. Oh no, those are just for our learning and our edification, rather than saying, oh wow, actually this Atlantic piece that I wrote that I was really proud of, that promotes the CCP. The CCP is now walking it out and trotting it around China as, look, American journalists are saying that we're doing a great job, and that's how we're staying in power. And so that happens with any of these articles. And so it's not so much. I don't think that we can make nuanced critiques of the Trump administration and giving relative grades for Trump administration versus the CCP's administration and handling of the crisis. But I think you have to come at it with like a good faith effort of like, is what I'm doing here, is it actually promoting an interesting idea that is furthering Americanism, American lives, or is this something that can be used as a tool in the CCP tool belt? And if the answer is the latter, I think you really need to put it back in the holster and not use it, because what it was and will continue to happen. Because before this, people forget. I wrote a couple articles for the Washington Examiner, Human Events, National Review, and others about the Chinese were exerting a social credit score system and a social set of rules that are so severe and so restrict that no American thinks such like liberty reducing mechanisms. But they were already doing that, and they were using the CCP. The CCP loves to do that. They're using information on people. And they're using, oh, look what the West is doing. Do you want to what the West is doing? You're be willing to accept less liberty, because if not, this is what happens in the West. And so like that division, that dissension, all of that kind of stuff leads to the West looking bad relative to the CCP in the way that the CCP spends their information to their people. So, I mean, from a propaganda standpoint, that's kind of what I think is happening. I think it'll get worse, frankly. I mean, I think the CCP gets stronger every time a crisis happens, and they handle it and are able to propagate that they handled it better than the West. And it also just shows people are willing to sacrifice. I mean, we saw this in this country after 9/11. We're going to see it further after this crisis, I'm sure. People are willing to accept less liberty if it means more safety. That's just the way it is. That's the way it always has been. That's the way it always will be. And so in order for them to propagate, hey, look how the Americans handled it. Outbreak spread to the whole country. More people died there than died here. And we kept you safe. Even if that's not true, which I find their numbers to be very, very debatable and suspicious. But once they say that, they'll be able to say, look, we did that, they didn't, trust us. And their party, they get stronger because of it.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really, really good point about being skeptical of the data coming out of China, specifically in the past week, as they said, as they've recorded basically no deaths over a certain period of time span, or no new cases, I think is what it was. And simultaneously, they've engaged in this massive disinformation campaign, and they've after they've already been known for suppressing medical information, not only to their own citizens and to the world during this crisis, but the press isn't seeming to question this data coming out of China. Obviously, I think this is a little bit of a softball, but should we be questioning that data? And what do you think is going on right now in China?
Always, it's interesting because there's been several instances of the Chinese heavily lying about their infrastructure numbers, heavily lying about their employment numbers, heavily lying about their GDP numbers. And, looking at it again, novel virus, coronavirus, I'm not a medical expert, I don't pretend to be, but I find it deeply suspicious that the numbers were escalating towards 80,000, and suddenly the numbers diminished dramatically from a exponential growth level to a less than 50 cases a day, and trying to make the argument that all the cases were now imported cases, meaning people traveling to China and infecting people from being infected abroad. And for me, I viewed that, and I think the numbers will bear it out one day, when actual people are able to learn from different internet chat rooms and medical professionals on the ground that are seeing the actual cases and trying to report the cases, were unable to do so for fear of reciprocity, etc. Um, I think that the numbers will bear out the fact that the Chinese realized that they wanted to propagate and change the locus of the center of the outbreak from China to Italy, to rebrand it as like an Italian coronavirus or an American virus. You saw that with, Twitter, the foreign minister for Twitter, the foreign comms person for Twitter, or for the CCP on Twitter, was arguing that the U.S. Army, was somehow to blame for the coronavirus. So trying to shift the locus, I think, made them realize if we just don't report the numbers, it'll look as if we're no longer the leader in this, and therefore the rest of the world can't handle it. What I think is probably happening, and again, like, I'm not a medical professional, I don't pretend to be, but I think what they're using is coronavirus is killing you in addition to something else, and rather than reporting as coronavirus killing you, they're saying like the underlying medical condition is what's killing you. So like in America, when they say, oh, so and so died of complications from coronavirus, they're reporting both. Person died of coronavirus, but also they had they had lymphoma or some other crazy thing. And rather than saying, oh no, the person died of lung cancer, oh no, they also died because of complications because of coronavirus. And I think you're just having an underreporting scenario. And I think the numbers will bear out as it goes on, because I mean just the population, the density of China alone, I find it deeply suspicious that they were able to contain cases in such a dramatic way. But we'll see if the numbers bear that out.
All right, so we are just about out of time. This is going to be my last question for you, but it is a doozy. It is very multifaceted, so take your time with it, please. So you've seen politicians come out like Senator Tom Cotton and say that China is going to pay. The first part of this question is, do you think that they will end up paying for this? Do you think the Trump administration takes this issue up before the election, after the election, or if at all, if you don't think that they're going to end up paying for it? And what does China, quote, paying for it look like? Are those new tariffs imposed by the United States? Is there multinational cooperation in imposing tariffs on China? Does the U.S. and the West fundamentally rethink China's role in the WTO and their role as co-founder of the WHO? And what can they do with these two institutions to, quote, make China pay, if at all?
I've seen that. I think that that's more of a saber rattling tactic, if anything. I don't see a situation where the Trump administration feels comfortable getting into another trade war. I mean, we saw the trade war basically ended up where we were more or less at the same spot that we left it. Maybe a few additional IP protections that we'll have to see how that plays out as businesses go forward. Obviously, as the market's been destabilized here, a lot of our gains, at least market-wise, production-wise, certainly corporately, I don't know how those gains haven't been erased, if not become irrelevant anyways because of the crash. I think what those guys are trying to get at is making them compensate us somehow for the medical costs of this, which are going to be just incredible. I mean, people are going to die in hospitals in very expensive ways, and there's going to be no one to pay for it. And I think figuring that out is going to be very, very complicated. I don't see a situation in which China pays for that. I have no reason to believe that they would. I think we also don't have the stomach, I think, to really withstand the prolonged battle that we would have to beat China in any reasonable way when it comes to pushing them out of the trade organizations or getting them sanctioned by the UN or anything like that. I mean, I think that's all of that is just going to be complicated. I think the big learning from this is the fact that we don't trust them in a lot of areas. We don't trust them really in business. We don't really trust them when it comes to trade, or certainly not, when it comes to the military. But I think that one of our learning processes from this is to understand that we need more people to be experts at China, to be able to speak Mandarin, to be able to, read their different chats, read their different, a lot of what happens is like coded language on their different internet platforms. And I don't know that we have the sophistication to do that. I mean, that's one way that Chinese experts were able to figure out that there was sort of a repressive revolution that was trying to get going after the Arab Spring, is that people were able to read the chat rooms, which were using coded language to try to get people to meet up together. I mean, the Hong Kong is a great example of that as well, where they're using different types of chat rooms and platforms to kind of coordinate information. I think that one of our learning mechanisms going forward is we need to get better at that, and we also, I think, expected that they would tell us the truth when it came to something as serious as a biological weapon for all intents and purposes, where that can spread around the globe and kill us all. And I think that we trusted them to tell us the truth on that, and it's been shown that they don't tell the truth, and we need to be prepared that they're not going to do that. And so I think going forward, coming up with some sort of international relationship that forces China to allow objective, global leaders or global medical leaders to come in and inspect situations early and get an actual read of what's going on the ground. I think we need to demand that. We need to see that comes through. I don't know how, I don't know what form that could take, but I think that needs to be something that happens immediately.
All right, that is just about all the time we have. Tyler, thank you so much for joining me today on The Elephant in the Room with Bradley Devlin. Also, if you haven't heard my full breakdown on the timeline of how China really bungled this in the beginning, go back and listen to that coronavirus episode. It was just a few episodes ago, so keep your eye on everything that's developing there. Also, give Tyler a follow on Twitter at Ty Gregory Grant. Stay updated on everything happening China and coronavirus, as well as keep an eye on his future pieces about China as we experience the full fallout of this thing. So Tyler, again, thanks for coming on. We hope to see you soon.
Yeah, thanks, Brad.